Some of you might actually wonder, why is migration on the topic of the Himalayan Consensus Summit? Isn't migration, after all, a result of lack of poverty, lack of economic opportunities, lack of sustainable economic growth, and hence not at all a very innovative and forward-looking solution towards a shared future for the Himalayan region? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Yes, you're right. Migration can, in fact, be, and has been in the past, and will probably be also in the future, a viable option to respond to the very human desire to seek a better future, a better life for themselves and for their children. So it is, by that sense, a possible response to poverty, to a lack of opportunities, to name just a few of the drivers, and we hear more about also the drivers of climate change later on. But the answer is also no, because as much as migration can be driven, in fact, by poverty or lack of opportunities, it can also, and very significantly so, be a transformative force of sustainable development. And so we can't dissect, in my view, migration from a discussion on the future of this region, because migration is, in the words of the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, an expression of the human aspiration for dignity, safety, and a better future. It is part of the social fabric, part of our very makeup as a human family. End of quote. So migration is indeed a development factor and has contributed in the past to developing societies around the world. But the recognition that migration and development are interlinked is actually quite a recent acknowledgement by the international community. If you look back to the Millennium Development Goals, migration was nowhere to be seen. It's not a factor. It was not a factor for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. The analysis, however, of how many countries in this region as well have reached the objectives of the Millennium Development Goals were indeed very much linked to migration. In Nepal, in Bangladesh, and in other countries of the world, Millennium Development Goals were also reached thanks to migration. This blind spot of the international community looking at how migration and development interlinks has actually been corrected now in the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. You will find throughout the document various references to migration. Specific ones, for example, in Goal 8.8, where we talk about the protection of the labor rights of all workers, but also, and explicitly mentioned, including migrant workers. There is the very specific target 10.7 that speaks on the importance of safe, regular, and orderly migration. But from the beginning, and Switzerland was very actively involved in pushing for the inclusion of migration in the 2030 Agenda, I was always an advocate of saying, don't look for migration by searching the word migration in the agenda. Look at how migration and migrants interact with almost each and every single one of the goals of the 2030 Agenda. This is where the true potential of migration lies. I've already mentioned that migration has reduced poverty, including in Nepal. It has increased enrollment of girls in primary and secondary education in Pakistan, for example. It has reduced infant mortality in Sri Lanka. It has driven industrial innovation. For example, 15 out of the 25 top US tech companies have first or second generation immigrants amongst their founders. So these are the facts. Migration can contribute to sustainable development. It has done so, and it will continue to do so. If we then further embrace what I would call the true spirit of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, which is an acknowledgement that this agenda is not a technocratic document to be implemented by donor agencies and planning commissions, but is really a societal task, a universal task for all of us, where we work together for a shared future where, as we've heard earlier this morning, each single colibri can contribute to it. We also understand that migration has to be part of our discussion. Migrants have to be part of this debate, of this narrative, of our stories that we are telling on how we want to frame the future of the Himalayan region, but more broadly, of our globe in general. Because, and again I repeat, migration is part of our social fabric. Now, I'm not naive. I've painted a rosy picture of migration, and I stand by these facts. But I'm not naive in the sense that I don't also see that migration has its shadows, its dark sides. Migrant workers are too often the labor and human rights egregiously abused. Millions of women, men, and children are victims of human traffickers. Migration often entails also not only financial, but also very much social and human costs. And the list, unfortunately, could go on and on. So the question then becomes, what can we do to foster, in a region like the one we are here today, the positive aspects of migration for sustainable development, while at the same time addressing the negative impact it has as well. Let me share with you 3 thoughts that, by pure coincidence, match the 3 topics of this year's summit: people, innovation, and cooperation. When we talk about people, it is about formulating migration policies and policies related to migration that are people-centered. Because, and this is almost too obvious to say, migration is about the people. If we talk about people-centered migration policies, we could talk about families left behind, for example, how important it is to take that fact of migration into consideration when we formulate migration policies or policies related to migration. We could talk about protecting the human and labor rights of migrant workers. We could talk about the needs of host communities and how important it is to look at sustainable inclusion and social cohesion. I would like to focus today on one specific aspect when it comes to people-centered migration, and this is migrant women. 48% of today's global human mobility are women. The picture that only men migrate is erroneous. There are certainly country-by-country differences, but globally speaking, migrant women make half of the migrant population universally. When we talk about migrant women, we too often approach this topic of migrant women by a misguided, almost paternalistic sense of protection. Migrant women are not vulnerable per se. They are, however, faced too often with policies, practices, social and cultural norms that put the migrant women in vulnerable situations. Now, this distinction between being vulnerable or being in a situation of vulnerability is actually not mere semantics. It's actually extremely critical to understand what we can do. If we acknowledge that the vulnerability of migrant women is not a fact of nature, but is actually man-made, literally man-made, we understand that it is very much in our hands to change the policies, the practices, the norms that put migrant women in situations of vulnerability. It is in our hands to change the future for migrant women. It is in our hands to make sure that people-centered migration policies are always also gender sensitive. What does it mean? It means, for example, to have women consular officers, so that when migrant women seek consular protection, they can discuss with a female consular officer. It means doing away with all gender-based barriers to financial services, for example. It means to ensure full labor and social protection for domestic workers, including, for example, the right to join trade unions. In other words, it is about ensuring the dignity of migrant women. And the dignity I define as the right to choose. Migrant women should always have the ability and the right to choose their own future, to choose their own abilities, what they want to do. And the right to choose, in my view, is a very appropriate definition of dignity. If we manage to get there, this will indeed unleash the full potential of migrant women as a freely contributing to sustainable development. And this is hugely important also for the future of this region. The second point is about innovation. Innovation, we can talk about modern technologies, for example. And indeed, migration can very well be impacted by modern technologies. If you think, for example, at the recruitment processes of migrant workers, technologies and digitalization can change the way that we recruit migrant workers by ensuring fair and ethical procedures. Just two examples. The information technologies available today give access to migrant workers to critical information about the labor market needs, for example, about the requirements, about the rights and obligations of migrant workers in foreign labor markets. It also gives access to evaluations of recruitment agencies. Switzerland has, together with the ILO, embarked several years ago on a broad project and program on fair and ethical recruitment. And one small side project of that was actually to establish a TripAdvisor-like platform for migrant workers, where they can access information where migrant workers give their assessment on recruitment agencies, rate that, so that then migrant workers can check up if the recruitment agency has received high rates or not. These are all technologies that allow us to ensure a future where fair and ethical recruitment is not a niche anymore, but becomes the market standard for recruitment of migrant workers. Another obvious area where we can see how innovation interacts with migration is remittances and financial inclusion. Today, many countries around the world are testing new modalities on sending remittances through iPhones and tablets, for example, dramatically reducing the costs, but at the same time also starting to build an entire network for financial inclusion so that migrant workers in their countries of destination can decide, I want to send out of the $150 that I want to send back, I'm sending $50 into a saving account of my wife. I'm sending $20 for the education costs of my children. I'm giving $30 to my wife for consumption, and I'm putting the rest of the money that I have maybe in a health insurance system that I contribute to. And all of this in the palm of our hands. And all of this by reducing the cost of remittances dramatically, and thereby also increasing financial inclusion. Innovation is therefore a driver for safer migration, but migration also drives innovation. By preparing today's intervention, I came across a story of a young Nepali student who went abroad to study in Germany. Once, when she heard about the earthquake that hit Nepal in 2015, she decided to come back. She studied architecture in Germany, and through a German-funded project, she could travel back to Nepal and put her skills, her innovation, her ideas that she acquired abroad to the service of the reconstruction of Nepal. So this highlights the importance of looking at how circular migration, how reintegrating the skills, the innovations, the ideas, the abilities of migrants returning is critically important. The last point, very briefly, I already see you standing, about cooperation. Cooperation is a key element to moving forward. Migration, by definition, brings us together, creates ties between people, between societies, between countries, and hence that is a pinnacle element to ensure cooperation. Cooperation obviously starts, and this is sort of where we go immediately with our mind, government-to-government cooperation, and that is essential. Cooperation between countries of origin and countries of destination. We have in this region a very well-established platform, the Colombo process, for example, that facilitates a dialogue between countries of origin. It then evolved further into the Abu Dhabi dialogue, which brings together countries of origin with countries of destination in the Gulf countries. That is critical. But when we talk about cooperation, once more we have to think out of the box, because migration is something that touches all of us. Talking about migration without the private sector is a one-way discussion. Not looking at what role trade unions can play in protecting the rights of migrant workers is a blind spot that we have to overcome. Academia plays a critical role. Local authorities play an absolute critical role because migration happens at the local level. This is where migrant workers live. This is where migrants interact with societies. So local authorities, cities, have to be part of our future discussion around migration. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in brief 15 minutes, maybe 16 minutes, I tried to depict a very broad picture around migration and showcasing how migration interacts with sustainable development, and thereby also laying maybe the foundation for the next intervention and then the panel afterwards. But really let me end by saying that I think also the future of the Himalayan region very much hinges on the fact on how we embrace migration. Migration is neither only positive nor only negative, but it is in our hands to shape migration in a way that it really contributes to sustainable development. And we shape it by making it people-centered, by being innovative, and by cooperating with all actors, including those here present today. Thank you very much.